Good morning, happy Friday. So I got asked a question. How do you get people to pivot essentially who don't want to? How do you get somebody to pivot who's got issues with whatever? And let's say that it's depression. So one of the first things is there's a lot going on in that question. Can you get people to change who don't want to change? Sure, it can happen. Remember, Ebenezer Scrooge is our great example of that. That's a guy who didn't want to change, and three neurolinguistic programmers came and visited him and showed him why he needed to change, and then he did. The thing that you got to think about in that example, yes, the cat is up again, is they knew what his leverage was. And one of the things that happens a lot is we try to change other people by using what would change us and not what would change them. And this is where professionals are a big help, because somebody who's trained in any of the normal methods, whether you're using the 6 human needs or you're using Myers-Briggs or whatever, is going to be able to understand leverage for that person, which is incredibly helpful. Trying to change loved ones, which is normally what we're talking about here, is incredibly difficult. And I'm awesomely guilty of this, because I have an absolute belief that if you'll talk to me, I can solve all your problems. And I've had that belief since I was a kid. And I've exercised on that since I was a kid, which is what makes me so good at my job. If you come in and talk to me, I can solve all your problems. But it's made me horrible in relationships, because I think if I just stick with this, I can solve all their problems. And the reality is there does come a point where a person's got to decide that they want to solve their own problem. And we can't always make them do that. I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges with addicts, is you're not going to get them to decide to change until they've hit rock bottom. So the question then becomes, what has to happen in order for them to hit rock bottom? And what we do when we try to answer that question a lot of times is we think, well, what would have to happen in order for me to hit rock bottom, not what would have to happen in order for them to hit rock bottom. There's other challenges in that situation too. Number one, when we get a label, clinically depressed, manic depressive, whatever, those can be extremely difficult to deal with, because once you get that label, then that can become your identity. And I'm not saying that those things don't exist. Please don't get me wrong. People can get very defensive about when this conversation is had by neurolinguistic programming people. When we talk about the power of the body over the mind, people who suffer from depression and those types of things will get defensive. This is real, it's not fake. We're not saying it's not real. We're just saying that once that label, once you get that label, for a lot of people, that now becomes who you are. I'm manic depressive. I'm clinically depressed. I'm this, I'm that. And if it becomes your identity, then that becomes very hard to shake. The only way to shake that is to decide, that this person needs to see that if this continues as their identity, then life is going to get worse for them, not better. They're going to lose something that's very valuable to them in order to get enough leverage in order to change them. Now, the reality is that whatever we've got going on, our physiology can have an incredibly dramatic impact on it. And that's the point that NLP is always trying to make. Smiling alone causes a chemical response in your body and in your brain that can change how you feel for a significant period of time. Watch the Amy Cuddy thing again, the old Wonder Woman pose and the Superman pose, things that people made fun of 20 years ago. Scientists are now figuring out that stuff really matters, and it doesn't just make you feel better in the moment. It changes the chemical makeup of your body. So that's not to say that it's going to cure everybody and it's a cure-all. I'm not saying that. But, do we have a system in our country where people over-medicate? Well, you can decide that, but I certainly think that we do. Do we have a system in our country where rather than looking at how somebody is taking care of their physical body and their diet, we just hand them a pill? I certainly think that that's the case. Whether or not you do is up to you. Getting loved ones to see how they need to pivot is incredibly difficult because you're in a relationship with them. And that makes it much harder, especially if it's a kid, especially if it's a spouse. My advice on that is to try to look at it from that person's perspective. What motivates them? If it's a child, who's their hero? And look for who they look up to. That's the person that can potentially have the influence to change the way that they're thinking and to get them to look in a direction that you think that they should look. If it's a spouse, my experience in this is that they have to understand what's at stake. And you have to understand as a spouse that they may or may not decide to change. We can't control people. We can only control our response to them. We can't control events. We can only control our response to them. One of the biggest things that I had to deal with when I did family law for years and years and years is the conversation always came down to this. The person who was getting divorced wanted the court system to make the person that they were divorcing a different person. That's what they really wanted. Well, I just want them to communicate with me and be reasonable. I just want them to be responsible. Well, if they were those things, you probably wouldn't have divorced them. And the court is not going to be able to do that. The court cannot change people. It can order people to do certain things, but at some point it can't just put everybody in jail. And whatever problems you're having with your spouse, once you get divorced, those problems are going to get worse, not better. Because the spouse is going to govern themselves a little bit if they're still in a relationship with you. But once they're not in a relationship with you, they might do the things that drive you crazy just because they drive you crazy, just to be that way. So understand, you can't control the people. You can only control the response. So when it comes to getting other people to see how they need to pivot, tough. Okay? That's what professionals are for. Get them to a true life coach, therapist. If they don't like life coach and they want to go to a therapist, we can all benefit from therapy. We can all benefit from life coaching. My only challenge with therapy is with some therapists, if they use, the typical approaches, it can take a long period of time, but I think a great deal of that is changing, and a great number of therapists now are using more direct approaches so that things don't take so long. So try to get them to something like that. But again, we can lead the horse to water, but we can't make it drink. Figure out what is their leverage. Understand the 6 human needs, or understand Myers-Briggs. Become very fluent in one of those particular, and there's more. There's all kinds of them. There's the Chinese seasons. There's the, whatever. Whichever filter that resonates with you, use it. And use that to understand what motivates the person that you're dealing with, and then try to speak their language as opposed to your language. And if you can, get them to a professional to try to help, And at the end of the day, remember this. People, especially kids, follow your feet, not your mouth. If you want somebody to act in a certain way, then you've got to have the integrity to act in that same way also. One of the great songs of my generation was the Beastie Boys, where he tells me not to smoke cigarettes, and that hypocrite smokes 2 packs a day. That was one of the cries from my youth. And that's really true, though. If you want a child to exercise and get up early and work hard and do all of those things, but you're not doing any of those things, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to influence them in that fashion. they're going to follow your feet a lot more than your mouth. The other thing with the spouse is, I spent a great number of years with a spouse trying to connect and bring along, and I held back. I would be much further in my career than I am had I not lost 10 years trying to fix somebody else. I don't regret that period of time because I spent it with my kid, but just saying you can't wait for everybody, and they have to decide if they're going to come along. And if they're not going to come along, finally, don't forget to mirror and match. If you're dealing with a kid, don't forget to mirror and match them. If you mirror and match them, you're going to feel what they're feeling, and that's going to be very, very helpful in terms of being able to communicate with them. So if you've got a teenager, that's another species, right? Mirror and match them when you're talking to them. And remember, 2 ears, 1 mouth, listen more than you talk, and see what you pick up by doing that. So getting loved ones to pivot, very difficult. Getting them to see, tough thing. Use others, okay? Learn a filter. Use others for help. Use others for other professionals. A lot of times it's a lot easier for a professional to tell somebody what they need to hear than it is for a loved one to tell somebody what they need to hear. Happy Friday, everybody. Thank you very much for watching. Miranda, Mark, and Dolores, good to see you guys this morning. You guys are up and at 'em early. Let's have a little coffee. And as my brother, Dan Mahoney, says, let's get after it. We're all in this together. Let's take care of each other. Thanks for watching, everybody.